Commander Lack stood at the front of the class as her students for the semester filtered in, observing with satisfaction that most species of the Confederation were represented. She found that diversity in her classroom was essential for the lessons she intended to teach. No group was more boring to teach than a room full of hulking males from war races, each with about 2 brain cells to share between them. Among the students, there were tiny Gallatin, frail Nixos, and the always unusual Toops, all searching for places to sit. Lack remained silent as the last students took their seats, standing at the front of the large auditorium with her usual stoic demeanor. The room was noisy, filled with the chatter of students who would soon be the military leaders of the Confederation. They were buzzing with excitement after all. Human 101 was the final required course before their graduation. Despite the chatter, Lack continued to wait, her deep red eyes scanning the room with a firm, unblinking gaze, offering no instructions or greetings. Gradually, the noise in the room began to die down. The students became uneasy, some exchanging nervous glances as they noticed that Commander Lack hadn't yet spoken. She was known for her discipline, a trait she had carried with her from her wartime experiences, and her classroom was as much a battlefield as any war she had fought in. The Kakolankian Military Academy had a reputation for strict instructors, each a veteran of countless battles. Lack was no different, though she often stood apart due to her quiet, imposing nature. As the last murmurs of conversation faded, the hall fell into a near silence. Then, finally, a brave student, a Rubel spawn, hesitantly raised their hand. Before they could utter a word, the large screen behind Lack erupted into light. Bold white letters appeared on a pitch-black background, reading, "Put your hand down." Connor, the entire room turned to stare at the Rubel spawn, who immediately shrank back into their shell. Lack suppressed a smirk. The students murmured once again, confused and unsure of what was happening. "Welcome to Human 101, Lack said finally, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. The bathrooms are out the back door, and to the left confusion flickered across the faces of her students. Some began to fidget in their seats, unsure whether to take her words seriously. Lack observed their reactions carefully, her years of experience allowing her to read the emotions on the faces of various species with ease. She knew confusion when she saw it. "Good, good," she said, her gaze landing on the Rubel spawn who had raised their hand earlier. "Come down here." The Rubel spawn hesitated, their head poking out of their shell once more, looking around nervously. As they began to rise from their seat, Lack interrupted sharply. "This has been your first lesson on humans." Her voice echoed through the hall, causing all eyes to snap back to the front. "Their name isn't Connor, that's a human name," she stated, her tone firm and unwavering. "But I have your undivided attention now, don't I?" The students, beginning to understand the point of the exercise, slowly nodded. Some of them had heard rumors about this course from previous students, despite the official ban on discussing it. The rumors had hinted at an unorthodox teaching style, but none had expected this. As they started to take notes, the screen behind Lack once again lit up with the same bold font. "Stop taking notes." The abrupt flash caught the attention of the note-takers, and murmurs once again spread through the room. Lack smirked, her red eyes gleaming. "What?" she asked, her voice raised. "Did you think I didn't know your names? Did you think I had to make one up like Connor? No, I know each of you, your actions and your habits. Don't assume you can fly under the radar in my class." Several students exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this was not going to be a typical class. Lack continued, "War is unpredictable. Humans are masters of it because they thrive in chaos and they adapt on the fly. That's the first thing you need to learn about them." The students were silent, their confusion giving way to a sense of intrigue. Lack took the opportunity to drive home her point. "Someone tell me," she said, pacing across the front of the room, "why did the Confederation lose its first war against humanity?" A small Simpar student, seated at the back, timidly raised a hand but quickly dropped it when Lack waved her hand dismissively. "No need to raise your hand, just speak," the Simpar squeaked out. "They used revolutionary new tactics that we couldn't overcome." Lack rolled her eyes. "Oh, General Cav, I didn't realize you were in my class," she said sarcastically. "Don't regurgitate the textbook." Have an original thought. The students exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. Finally, the Rubel spawn from earlier spoke up, their voice wavering but clear. They were unpredictable. They kept catching the Confederation off guard, doing whatever it took to win. Lax smiled. "Exactly," she said. "Humans are unpredictable. They don't follow the rules of engagement. They do whatever it takes to win, even when it seems insane." Lack continued to explain that the course wasn't about learning human tactics or strategy specifically, but about understanding the essence of what makes humans formidable in warfare: their adaptability, their resilience, and their willingness to go to extremes. Humans, she said, will push themselves through unimaginable pain and hardship to achieve their goals. They'll ignore their own plans if it means winning the fight. She glanced around the room. How are you supposed to counter an enemy that doesn't even follow their own strategy? The students remained silent, their attention fully on Lack now. She had them exactly where she wanted them. "If you ever fight against humans," she warned, "you'll find that no one deals with the chaos of war better than they do." Lack paused, allowing her words to sink in. The students were visibly uncomfortable, their earlier enthusiasm for the course now replaced by a sense of caution. "Someone else," she called out, her voice softer but no less commanding, "tell me why humans are so hard to defeat." A small Ciara, seated towards the middle of the room, hesitantly raised a hand but remembered Lack's earlier instruction and quickly dropped it. They don't give up," the Ciara said, voice barely audible. "Even when they're losing, they find a way to keep fighting." Lack nodded slowly, her gaze intense. "Exactly. Humans don't quit. They'll fight to their last breath, even when the situation is hopeless. This," she said, her voice rising again, "is the core lesson of this class. Humans will put up with and push through the most unimaginable situations just to come out on top." Lack moved to the large screen behind her, which flickered to life once again, displaying images of various battlefields where humans had fought. Some images were old, from the early wars between the Confederation and humanity, while others were more recent, showing skirmishes and battles where humans had either been allies or enemies of other species. "Look at these images," Lack said, gesturing to the screen. In each one, humans were outnumbered, outgunned, or facing some kind of insurmountable odds. And yet, she pointed to several instances of humans overcoming their adversaries. They found a way to win. Even when they were on the verge of defeat, they kept going. The students leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the images flashing before them. "Who here has seen the latest Brockworth Weisel film?" Lack asked suddenly. Hesitant hands went up around the room. "Good. And how many of you remember the scene where Sergeant McDavid broke his arm in battle but kept fighting with just a knife?" The students nodded, a few murmuring in agreement. "Impressive," right? Lack scoffed, shaking her head. "Wrong." The students looked confused. "Humans are trained to fight and reload their rifles with just one arm," Lack explained. "I've seen it myself. At the Battle of Monty, I was pinned down with a human private, a damn private who had her arm ripped off by a bug. She tied off the stump, stabbed herself with morphine, and kept fighting with one hand." Lack's voice was filled with a mix of admiration and frustration as she spoke. "Humans don't give in. They fight their way out of impossible situations, bleeding, broken, but still alive." One of the students, the small Ciara from earlier, raised a trembling hand. Did she make it?" they asked, their voice filled with nervousness. Lack paused, her expression darkening for a brief moment. "No," she said quietly. "Her name was Private Connor, and she bled out 30 feet from our lines. But she saved my life. Remember this," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "Humans aren't invincible. They just don't give up until they're dead. That's the core of this class. You'll never be able to fully predict what a human will do, because they'll throw every plan and every strategy out the window if it means staying alive and winning." Lack turned back to the screen, which now displayed images of various human soldiers in action fighting in the mud, in space, on hostile alien worlds. You're going to observe them firsthand, Lack said, her voice taking on an ominous tone. It's time for a field trip. The room erupted with excited chatter, students turning to each other and gesturing animatedly, some even standing up in anticipation. But before they could rush out the door, Lack's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "And where do you think you're going?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing at the impulsive students. The room fell silent once more as the students awkwardly shuffled back to their seats, unsure of what they had done wrong. Lack allowed the silence to hang for a moment before speaking again. "Answer me this: how far is it to the nearest human establishment?" The students exchanged confused glances. Some of the more experienced students, those who had been in Lack's classes before, began to catch on to her point. Slowly, realization spread across the room, embarrassment coloring the faces of those who hadn't yet figured it out. "Exactly," Lack said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "The closest human planet is 42 light-years away. Did you think I chartered a starliner for us?" She shook her head, clearly unimpressed. "Sit your dumb asses down." The screen behind her flickered again, this time displaying a holographic projection of a human bar. The projection was so realistic that it looked as though the front of the lecture hall had opened up to reveal the scene beyond. "This is a bar," Lack said dryly, "the natural habitat of the human soldier." The students stared in awe as the projection showed a human in military fatigues entering the bar, the door swinging open to reveal a night sky behind them. "This is a live feed from a bar on a human military base," Lack explained, her voice calm as always. "The bartender is a friend of mine and lets me tap into his security cameras once a year for this lesson." The students were mesmerized, watching the scene unfold. It was one thing to hear stories about humans or to see staged films about their exploits, but this was real. "After a few minutes," Lack shouted, "call out interesting things you've observed." Almost immediately, a Rubel spawn raised their voice, pointing out the group of 8 males converging around a single female with little interaction between themselves. "Good observation," Trilly Lack said, nodding. "Human sexual dimorphism means males are generally more common in the military. This can lead to certain cultural behaviors that you, as their commanders, need to manage. It's important to keep an eye on these dynamics, or you'll lose control of your unit." Another student pointed out an unconscious human at a table, abandoned by their companions who had gone to the bar for more drinks. Lack's gaze turned steely. "What do we say when a human offers us alcohol?" she asked the class. "No, thank you," they chanted in unison. "And what do we say when they offer again?" Lack continued. "Okay, fine, just one," the students responded, their voices lacking the enthusiasm from before. Lack nodded. "Exactly. Inebriated humans love company, but it can become a competition and you will lose. Just like that human over there," she gestured to the unconscious soldier. "But watch their companions. Even as they drink more, they're still checking on their friend. That's how you tell a good human soldier they take care of their own." Lack continued pointing out details in the projection, guiding her students through the subtle intricacies of human behavior, preparing them for what they would need to know if they ever found themselves leading or fighting alongside humans. Finally, she drew their attention to a lone figure sitting in a dark corner, downing glass after glass of a brown liquid. "Why this human?" she asked her students. "Why am I pointing them out?" The students watched intently, but struggled to answer. "They're having a drinking contest," one student suggested, but only with themselves. Lack nodded approvingly. "Good observation. But it's more accurate to say they're having a drinking contest against their memories. Humans deal with trauma better than most species, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take a toll." The class fell silent as they considered her words. Lack continued, her tone more somber now. "The biggest challenge for human soldiers isn't the enemy in front of them, it's the battles they fight within themselves. Many of them will try to handle their pain alone, thinking they're sparing others from their suffering. But that only makes things worse." She glanced around the room, ensuring she had their full attention. "If you ever find yourself commanding human soldiers, you need to recognize this. Their resilience is their greatest strength, but it's also their biggest weakness. You could save a life just by paying attention. One student, the Rubel spawn from earlier, raised a tentacle. When was this recorded, they asked, their voice filled with curiosity. Lax smiled, impressed by the question. Good thinking, she said. But this isn't a recording. Its live gasps erupted from the students who were biologically capable of making such a sound. They looked around in disbelief, unsure if she was tricking them again. But this time, Lack wasn't joking. This is what you'll see at any human military bar, a soldier blaming themselves for something that wasn't their fault. It's your job as their commander to recognize that. Not if, but when the silence in the room was thick as Commander Lack let her words hang in the air. The students sat still, absorbing the weight of what she had just told them. The live projection of the human bar scene continued in the background, showing the lone human soldier lost in their thoughts, pouring another drink. Lack turned away from the screen and faced the class, her deep red eyes scanning the room, making sure that each student understood the gravity of the lesson. Human soldiers, she said slowly, have one of the highest rates of suicide among all known species. Survivor's guilt is something nearly all of them will experience. This is the negative side of what makes them so resilient. The emotional toll is heavy, and sometimes they break. A murmur rippled through the class. The students exchanged worried glances, some fidgeting uncomfortably in their seats. Lack's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. You might think you'll never be in a position to command humans. You might think this course is just a formality before graduation. But if you ever find yourself leading human soldiers, you must be prepared for this. Not just the battlefield, but what comes after. You need to recognize the signs, because if you do, you might just save a life. She stared at them, her gaze piercing. And trust me, she added softly, human lives are worth saving. The students were silent, their earlier excitement about the field trip now replaced by a somber realization. The weight of the lesson settled on their shoulders, and even the more carefree students seemed to take it to heart. Lack allowed them a moment to reflect before shifting gears. That's enough for today, she said, her voice regaining its usual authoritative tone. But next week we'll continue our observation of human soldiers. You'll learn more about their culture, their behaviors, and their instincts. This course is designed to challenge your assumptions about humans, and I expect each of you to be fully engaged. As the students began to gather their belongings, preparing to leave, Lack stayed rooted in place, watching them carefully. She knew from years of experience that many of them wouldn't fully grasp the importance of these lessons until much later, some not until they were in the thick of a real conflict. But for now, she was planting the seeds. As they filed out, some of the students exchanged quiet conversations, still processing the day's revelations. Lack remained at the front, her gaze steady, waiting for the room to clear. Once the last student had left, Lack let out a slow breath, releasing the tension that had built up over the course of the lecture. She walked to the side door of the hall, where a tall human stood waiting for her, arms crossed. You ready? She asked, her voice softer than it had been moments ago. The human Liam Thorne, former field marshal of the human collective armies, grinned wryly. I hate doing this, he replied, shaking his head. It's always weird teaching a class about us like we're some exotic species. Lack rolled her eyes. You are an exotic species, she shot back, her tone playful. My wife is a xenobiologist, remember? She studies all non-arc-based life forms, but I get the pleasure of studying you. Thorne chuckled. Yeah, but it still feels like I'm a monkey in a zoo. Lack smirked and patted him on the cheek. Well, you are a monkey. Now come on, let's get this over with. I'll buy you a banana afterward. Thorne groaned, but the faint smile on his face betrayed his amusement. Together they walked onto the stage, facing the empty auditorium. For Lack, this was always the calm before the storm. Soon, the next group of students would take their seats, ready for the infamous Human 201 course, which had a reputation for being even more intense than the first. But before they got to the heart of it, there was still one final moment to be shared. The room grew quiet again as a thorn took his place at the center of the stage, waving in his casual, almost awkward manner, a stark contrast to his legendary status as one of the most decorated human soldiers in history. For someone who had commanded massive military operations, he had surprisingly little stage presence. But that was part of the lesson too, Lack knew. She had designed this course to show her students that humans could not be neatly categorized or understood through their records alone. Here's how this next part of the course works, Lack began, addressing the group that had already started to filter back into the room for the afternoon session. Every week I will bring in a new human for you to interact with. You'll have the entire class period to ask them questions, talk to them, and get to know them. By the next session, I expect a full report on the human's behavior, your impressions of them, and how those impressions compare to their recorded history. This is the real challenge, understanding that what you see on paper often doesn't match what you experience in person. The students, intrigued by the sudden shift in tone, began raising their hands almost immediately. Lack gestured to a student in the front row who asked the first question eagerly. "Is it true that you killed a Tantor with your bare hands?" The question was directed at a thorn, who gave a slight nod, his hand instinctively moving to his prosthetic leg. "Yes," he said simply. A flurry of hands shot up again, and Lack let the questions roll, each more dramatic than the last. "Did you really dive into a panite-infested lake to rescue a downed helicopter crew?" One by one another student asked. A thorn nodded once more. Yes, the room buzzed with excitement. "Did they have to physically hold you back from going in again because you were collapsing from exhaustion?" A thorn chuckled. "Yeah, they held me back. I wasn't exactly in the best shape to keep going." Lack stood back, watching the interaction unfold. She had deliberately kept the true nature of this course a secret from the students, knowing that their reactions to meeting real humans would be a crucial part of their learning experience. Thorn, for his part, was playing along perfectly, revealing just enough to keep them hooked, but still holding back on the deeper lessons they would eventually have to confront. The questions continued, each one more focused on Thorn's legendary accomplishments. Lack watched as her students struggled to reconcile the casual, unassuming man standing before them with the mythic figure they had read about in their textbooks. It was exactly what she wanted them to experience, the realization that no matter how much you study or prepare, you can never truly understand a human until you've interacted with one. As the session drew to a close, Lack glanced at the clock. "Any last questions before we wrap up?" she asked. Trilly, the Rubel spawn who had been quiet for most of the session, raised their hand. "How do you know Commander Lack?" they asked, their voice steady but curious. A thorn turned to Lack, his expression softening. "Are we clear to talk about classified materials?" he asked, his tone teasing but serious. Lack nodded slowly. A thorn turned back to the class, a small smile playing on his lips. "We were joint commanders during the Void Ravik invasion." The room exploded into chaos. Students gasped and whispered to each other, shocked by the casual revelation of what was considered one of the most important military events in recent history. "Quiet down," Lack shouted, her voice commanding silence once more. One of the students raised a hand, trembling with excitement. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" they asked. "Because it has nothing to do with this course," Lack replied, her voice firm. A thorn, however, grinned. "But it's classic human behavior to make everything about ourselves, so let's do that." The students erupted into laughter, the tension in the room breaking. A thorn and Lack shared a look, one of mutual understanding and respect. The rest of the class went longer than usual, as a thorn regaled them with stories not only about the invasion but also about Lack herself. When the final student left, Lack slumped in her chair, her body aching from the strain of standing for so long. "You should get that looked at," a thorn said, sitting beside her. Lack smirked. "And you should upgrade that prosthetic leg so you don't hurt after standing for hours," she shot back. They shared a moment of quiet, two old soldiers who had seen too much but couldn't help coming back to share what they knew. "Thanks for coming," Lack said after a pause. "I appreciate it. Even if you did tell them about the fried chicken incident." A thorn laughed. "How could I not? It's one of the best stories. Lack rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. As they walked out of the hall together, a thorn wrapped his arm around her shoulder. So, do I still owe you that banana? Lack chuckled. Yes, you do?